Imagine standing on the edge of ancient Rome as the sun sinks behind the 7 hills. The air is thick with the scent of olive oil, bread, and dust. The great city that ruled the world slowly exhales, and night begins to breathe. In the fading glow of twilight, the merchants pack their stalls, the slaves carry the last jars of wine, and the cobblestones gleam like gold. Rome is falling asleep. If you're listening to Unwind tonight, take a deep breath. Let the sounds of ancient Rome carry you far away from your thoughts. Close your eyes and drift back 2,000 years to the moment when the eternal city closed its eyes. As the last rays of daylight fade over the rooftops, the hum of Rome softens to a murmur. The forum, once roaring with arguments and deals, grows still. The marble pillars cast long shadows that stretch toward the Tiber River, and pigeons settle on the ledges of statues older than memory itself. A lone baker wipes the sweat from his forehead, sliding the final loaves from his oven. A woman in a wool shawl hurries home with a clay jar of oil pressed to her chest. The streets smell of warm bread, spilled wine, and smoke drifting from the baths. At this hour, the light in Rome changes, not bright, not dark, but golden. It clings to every surface like a secret. Somewhere deep in the Subura, the poor and crowded district, a tavern door creaks open. Inside, the faint laughter of workers mixes with the slow drip of watered wine. A lute hums a tune older than the empire itself. This is where Rome's nightlife begins, not in the grand palaces, but in the corners where no senators walk. Down the alley, a young man named Cassius leans against a crumbling wall, staring at the sunset. He is not a noble nor a soldier. He is a scribe, a quiet watcher of the city, who spends his days copying letters for men too rich to write their own. But at night, he writes for himself. His wax tablets hold secrets, words of love, doubt, and wonder. Sometimes he writes about what he sees: the baker who sings to his bread, the girl who sweeps the steps of a tavern and hums to herself, the philosopher who argues with no one in particular. To Cassius, Rome is not marble and glory. Its stories, thousands of them, whispered between sunset and dawn. As the bells of the forum fade, he walks down the narrow path toward the river. The stones are slick from the day's heat. The sound of sandals echoes through the arches. He watches as a slave lights an oil lamp above a doorway, its flame trembling in the breeze. The smell of roasted fish drifts from a nearby stall. A child laughs, and somewhere a temple door closes with a deep, echoing sigh. For most, this is the end of the day. But for others, the poets, the dreamers, the lonely, the night is just beginning. Cassius finds himself outside an old tavern, the Resting Laurel. Its faded sign sways above the entrance. Inside, the room glows with flickering candlelight. Voices murmur softly. Someone plucks a lyre, off-key but sincere. He steps in, greeted by the warmth of the hearth and the smell of spiced wine. A woman with kind eyes nods at him from behind the counter. "Long day?" she asks. Cassius smiles faintly. "A long life," he replies. He sits by the window, where he can watch the alley shimmer in the glow of oil lamps. He opens his wax tablet and begins to write. When the sun sets on Rome, the masks fall. The city shows its true face, weary, tender, and alive. Outside, the streets change, shadows grow bold. A group of young philosophers gather under a stone arch, arguing about the soul. A flute plays from a distant balcony. A woman walks by with a basket of figs, her robe catching the light of a passing torch. Everything slows, everything softens. The chaos of daylight fades into the poetry of darkness. Cassius lifts his cup of watered wine and watches the reflection of the candle sway inside it. He wonders if the emperors feel loneliness too, or if that is something only the ordinary hearts of Rome can afford. He looks outside once more. The moon is rising above the rooftops, and as it does, he feels that ancient pull, the call of the city that never sleeps, yet somehow dreams. He writes again, quietly, perhaps the gods, to watch us in silence, waiting to see what we become after the sun goes down. A gentle breeze slips through the open shutters. The candle flickers, then steadies again. The night deepens. Rome exhales. The sound of distant laughter echoes from the next street. Cassius listens, not to the words, but to the rhythm of life itself. The day belongs to power, he thinks, but the night belongs to the soul. And somewhere beyond the walls, the city hums, alive and endless, ready for the strange, secret hours yet to come. The moon had climbed higher over the rooftops of Rome, painting the narrow streets in silver light. A cool breeze moved through the alleys, stirring the scent of roasted chestnuts, olive oil, and old stone. The noise of the day had long faded, replaced by a softer music, laughter, footsteps, and the rhythmic beating of distant drums from the lower quarters. Cassius remained in the resting laurel, his cup of watered wine half full, the candle on his table melting into a shallow pool of wax. The tavern was quieter now. Only a few patrons lingered, a merchant too tired to count his coins, a pair of guards whispering about an arrest near the market, and an old man sitting by the fire, humming to himself. That old man was known to everyone as Lucan the poet. Though poet might have been too kind a title, he had once written verses that were recited in noble houses. Now he traded his rhymes for food and wine, scribbling on scraps of parchment between bouts of memory and melancholy. Cassius watched as Lucan dipped a quill into ink and wrote slowly, the parchment trembling slightly in his wrinkled hands. Curious, Cassius approached. "Mind if I sit?" he asked softly. Lucan looked up, his eyes bright but unfocused. "You already have, in a sense," he replied with a faint smile. "You're one of those who listens, not just hears. Sit." Cassius lowered himself into the chair opposite the poet. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across Lucan's face. "What do you write about?" Cassius asked. "The same thing I've written about for 40 years, Lucan said, his voice half laugh, half sigh. "Rome, her people, her lies, her beauty. She never changes, only the names do." He handed Cassius the parchment. On it were a few lines. "When night descends on marbled dreams, and candles weep their golden tears, Rome whispers softly in her sleep of glory lost and passing years." The words were fragile, yet heavy with meaning. Cassius read them twice, feeling something stir in him, a recognition, perhaps, or a sadness that had no name. Lucan leaned back, closing his eyes. "We poets are ghosts, you know. We haunt the living with memories they'd rather forget." Cassius smiled faintly. "And yet, without you, Rome would forget herself." The old man opened one eye, amused. "You sound like a philosopher." "I'm just a scribe," Cassius replied. "But I suppose all who write are a little cursed with thought." The tavern door opened briefly, letting in a gust of cool air. A young woman entered, carrying a lute case over her shoulder. Her name was Livia, a traveling musician who had been known in several taverns across the city. She moved gracefully, her steps soft against the stone floor. Lucan raised a hand in greeting. "Play something for us, Livia. The night is too quiet." She smiled, setting her lute upon her lap. "For you, old friend, always." Her fingers plucked a gentle melody, slow and warm, like moonlight settling on water. The sound filled the tavern, mingling with the crackle of the fire and the faint whisper of the night beyond the walls. Cassius listened, letting the notes wash over him. The tune told stories of lovers separated by war, of sailors lost to the sea, of poets who sang to the stars because no one else would listen. For a moment, all the world seemed suspended in that song. The merchants forgot their debts. The guards forgot their orders. Even the old poet seemed young again, his eyes glistening as he mouthed the words to an old refrain. When the song ended, there was no applause, only a shared silence, the kind that exists between souls who have remembered something ancient. Livia looked at Cassius. "How did you know?" "The ones who listen most deeply always do," she said, gently tuning her lute. "What do you write about?" Cassius hesitated. "About the night. About what it reveals when no one's pretending to be grand." Livia nodded, as if she understood completely. "Then you'll like what Rome says after midnight. The city starts speaking then, softly, in the cracks of the walls and the rustle of the river." Lucan chuckled. "Careful, boy. Listen too closely, and you might never sleep again." But Cassius did listen. He sat by the window, gazing out into the alley where the moonlight pooled like milk upon the cobblestones. From somewhere far off came the faint sound of chanting, a priest, perhaps, or a secret gathering. The city's breath was alive with stories. Lucan began reciting one of his old poems, half remembered, his voice trembling like the flame of the candle before him. "Beneath the arches, shadows dance, with ghosts of marble kings, and all who walk in Rome at night hear history as it sings." The tavern seemed to breathe with those words. Every brick, every timber, every candle seemed to lean closer, as if the walls themselves were listening. Cassius felt a strange calm settle over him, not the kind of calm born from sleep, but from connection. He realized that Rome at night was not a city of loneliness, but of quiet companionship. People who lived in daylight never knew that the truest form of humanity came alive after sunset, when masks fell and hearts dared to speak. Livia played one last song, a lullaby once sung to Roman children during storms. Her voice was low and soothing, like a whisper from another world. As she sang, Cassius wrote again, his stylus gliding across the wax tablet. "The night is not dark, it's honest. In its silence, every soul confesses its truth." Lucan smiled, as if hearing the thought aloud. "You'll make a poet yet, scribe." "Perhaps," Cassius said, smiling faintly. "But for now, I'll just keep listening, outside." The wind carried the faint scent of the Tiber and the distant sound of laughter from another tavern down the hill. Rome was awake in her dreams, alive with memory and longing. The candle on their table burned lower. The wax reached its end, and as the flame flickered and died, the night embraced them all in its quiet rhythm, a reminder that even in the heart of empire, peace could still be found in the smallest moments. And somewhere, beyond the reach of light, the eternal city whispered another secret, waiting for someone like Cassius to hear it. The streets of Rome glistened after a brief drizzle, the cobblestones reflecting lantern light like molten gold. Cassius walked slowly through the winding alleys of the Aventin Hill, his sandals whispering against the damp stones. The parchment in his hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but anticipation. It had been slipped to him under his cup earlier that evening, when he'd returned to the resting Laurel. The message was simple, written in neat, hurried Latin. When the third watch begins, follow the scent of myrtle and the sound of laughter. Speak no name, the feast awaits, no signature. Only a small wax seal, the impression of a laurel wreath and a flame. Cassius had shown it to no one, not to Lucan, not even to Livia, who'd been playing a soft melody by the tavern door when he left. Something about the note stirred him, a curiosity mixed with the quiet pull of adventure. Rome at night could be dangerous, yes, but it was also alive with mystery. And for a man who spent his days copying decrees and market lists, a secret feast felt like a call to step beyond the ordinary. As he turned down a narrow lane, the faint scent of myrtle brushed past him, subtle but distinct. He followed it, his breath misting faintly in the cool air. The laughter came next, low, musical, echoing from somewhere beneath the earth. Finally, he reached a worn archway, carved with faded symbols, ivy leaves, a lamp, and what looked like a mask. A small torch burned beside it. Without a word, Cassius ducked through the opening and descended a narrow stair, spiraling into darkness. The air grew warmer as he went down, thick with the aroma of baked bread, roasted meat, and spiced wine. At the bottom, the passage widened into a chamber softly lit by oil lamps. Shadows danced along frescoed walls, depicting feasts and celestial constellations. A long table stood in the center, surrounded by people from every walk of life. A scholar with ink-stained fingers, a soldier still wearing his cloak, a merchant woman with gold bangles, even a veiled noblewoman who watched the room with quiet curiosity. At the head of the table stood a man Cassius recognized immediately, though he'd never spoken to him. It was Marcus Varro, a minor senator and known patron of philosophers. He smiled as Cassius entered, lifting a cup in welcome. "Another seeker joins us," Varro said warmly. "Sit, friend. Tonight we feast not for wealth or power, but for the hunger of thought." Cassius obeyed, taking an empty seat beside the merchant woman. She offered a nod, her eyes kind and knowing. The table was a humble one, but beautiful bowls of olives, loaves of bread, figs, roasted lamb, and pitchers of wine lined the center. Yet, as Cassius quickly realized, it wasn't the food that mattered here. It was the conversation. Varro raised his cup. "To those who live by night, thinkers, poets, dreamers, may our voices echo where truth fears to tread." Everyone drank. The room hummed with quiet laughter and the soft clink of pottery. A philosopher began to speak, his words slow and deliberate. "Tell me," he said, "if Rome's greatness rests upon the backs of slaves, can it ever be truly noble?" The soldier chuckled. "Nobility is a luxury of peace. Without those backs, there would be no empire to debate over." Livia's voice drifted softly from a corner of the room she had been invited to. It seemed, her lute resting gently on her knees. "Perhaps both are right," she murmured. "Perhaps greatness and guilt are two strings of the same instrument. You can't pluck one without hearing the other." The room grew thoughtful. Cassius listened, fascinated. He felt as if he had stepped into another Rome, not the marble one built by day, but a living, breathing mind that came alive when the torches burned low. The merchant beside him leaned in. "This gathering has no name," she whispered. It happens once each month, when the moon hides. Here we share what cannot be said aloud above ground. Why? Cassius asked softly. Because truth is safest in the dark, she said. Another speaker, a woman in a deep green cloak, stood and recited something that sounded like a hymn. By lamp and loaf, by fire and friend, we eat the words that never end. For silence speaks when hearts align, and night reveals what gods confine. The verse hung in the air, luminous. Cassius felt a shiver run through him, not of fear, but recognition. This was more than a secret club. It was a refuge for thinkers, artists, and the quietly discontent. People who saw the cracks in Rome's marble face and sought to fill them with meaning instead of ambition. Varro noticed Cassius's thoughtful gaze. You are new, he said gently. Tell us, what do you seek in the night? Cassius hesitated. All eyes turned toward him. Listen, he said finally. I write down what the city whispers, the words of its stones, its people, even its ghosts. I suppose I'm seeking what Rome truly is beneath all her noise. The senator nodded approvingly. Then you belong here more than most, for Rome is a chorus, and only those who listen can hear her truest song. The others murmured their agreement, raising their cups once more. As the night deepened, the feast continued, not loud or wild, but soft and thoughtful. Ideas passed from one to another like shared bread. Someone spoke of the stars above the city, another of justice, another of the loneliness of power. Between the talk, Livia played, her music flowing like warm wine through every pause. Cassius felt the hours slip away unnoticed. There was a peace in this place that daylight never offered, a communion of minds instead of masks. When the final candle began to fade, Varro stood again. We meet not to defy Rome, he said, but to remember that Rome's heart was once human. Let us not let it turn to stone. The room was silent. Then, slowly, each person placed a hand over their chest, a quiet vow of understanding. Cassius followed suit. When he finally stepped back into the cool night air, dawn was only a whisper away. The city lay hushed beneath a pale sky, unaware of the gathering that had just taken place beneath her feet. Cassius looked toward the horizon, where the first light brushed the domes of temples and the tips of statues. He smiled faintly. Rome was waking, but for once he didn't feel like just another scribe among millions. He had tasted something rare, not wine, not power, but truth shared in whispers. And though the night was ending, Cassius knew it would never truly leave him. Morning came to Rome like a whisper, pale light spilling gently across tiled roofs and marble steps. Cassius woke to the faint hum of the marketplace, the call of vendors, the clang of hammers on bronze. Yet, beneath the familiar sounds, something new stirred within him, a soft echo of the night before. The feast still lingered in his mind, the laughter, the verses, the strange unity among strangers. He remembered Varro's words, Rome is a chorus, and only those who listen can hear her truest song. But the memory that clung to him most was not of the senator, nor the poet, nor the wine. It was of the old man who had spoken near the end, the philosopher with the weathered robe and gentle knowing eyes. Cassius had barely noticed him before that moment. He had sat quietly, half in shadow, tracing circles on the table with one finger, as if marking time itself. When he finally spoke, the entire chamber had gone still. Truth, the old man had said softly, is a flame that warms, but it burns those who keep it too long. At the time, Cassius had thought it only another proverb, but as the day stretched on, those words refused to fade. He found himself distracted at work, his quill hovering over parchment, as thoughts wandered back to that dim chamber underground. He felt both grateful and uneasy, as if he had glimpsed something sacred, but not yet understood its cost. That evening, as the city glowed gold beneath the setting sun, Cassius walked again through the crowded forum. The air was thick with the smell of roasted grain and spiced wine. Musicians played near the temples, lovers strolled under colonnades, and merchants shouted prices in a dozen dialects. Rome was alive, dazzling, unrelenting, and yet, amid all the noise, he felt the silence of the feast calling him again. He turned down a quieter street, where the shadows stretched long between buildings. There, sitting on the edge of a fountain, was the philosopher himself. He looked exactly as he had the night before, same threadbare robe, same distant calm. The man seemed to belong more to the past than the present. Cassius approached, uncertain. "You were at the gathering," he said softly. The philosopher nodded without surprise. "As were you, young scribe." "I wanted to thank you," Cassius said. "Your words stayed with me." The man smiled faintly. "Most words vanish when the speaker sleeps. The dangerous ones are those that linger." Cassius frowned. "Dangerous." The philosopher studied him. "Do you know why the feast is hidden, Cassius?" He shook his head. "Because Rome fears what cannot be controlled," the man said quietly. "We gather to speak truth freely, and freedom in this city is a dangerous appetite." Cassius felt a chill, though the evening was warm. But it was just talk, philosophy, poetry, ideas. "Exactly," said the old man. "And ideas are the only things that ever change empires." He leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Be careful where you let your curiosity lead. The feast welcomes thinkers, yes, but among them walk listeners too. Not all who raise their cups do so in friendship." Cassius felt his pulse quicken. "You mean spies?" The philosopher gave a slow nod. "There are ears beneath the Senate's floor, in the taverns, even in the feasts of thought. Rome feeds on secrets, and sometimes she swallows those who speak too boldly." He looked out toward the crowd in the distance, the endless river of people moving through the streets. "Truth is a gift, young man, but so is silence. Learn when to hold each." Cassius stood quietly, unsure how to answer. At last, the philosopher rose. "Walk with me," he said. They moved together through the narrow streets. The city dimmed as torches were lit along walls and doorways. Somewhere, a lute played a slow tune, familiar, like the one Livia often played at the Resting Laurel. "You're wondering why you were invited," the old man said after a while. Cassius nodded. "Yes, I thought it was chance." "Nothing in Rome is chance," the philosopher murmured. "You were chosen because you listen, and because words, when written, survive longer than speakers." Cassius's breath caught. "You mean they want me to write about them?" "Perhaps," the old man said. "Or perhaps they want to use you, as all great minds are used when politics and philosophy intertwine." They paused beside an archway where ivy crept along the stone. The philosopher turned to face him fully now, his eyes deep with something between warning and sorrow. "You must decide what kind of man you wish to be," he said. "A chronicler of beauty or of truth. One brings comfort, the other brings trouble." Cassius swallowed hard. "And if both live in the same story, then," the philosopher said, "you will have to choose which one to end." For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the sound of distant voices and the soft trickle of a nearby fountain filled the silence. Finally, the philosopher placed a hand on Cassius's shoulder. "When the next feast comes, go. Listen, but not with your ears. Listen with caution." And before Cassius could ask another question, the man turned and vanished down the street, his steps soundless, his figure swallowed by the dark. That night Cassius returned home, but sleep refused him. The sounds of Rome outside his window, the chatter of late drinkers, the creak of wagon wheels, all seemed distant, like echoes in a dream. He rose and lit a single oil lamp, the flame small but steady. On the table lay a blank parchment. He hesitated, then began to write. Not about decrees or market tallies, but about the night beneath the city, about the feast, the verses, the warning. His quill moved slowly, each word careful, like a secret confession. When he finished, he read the last line aloud. "Some truths are not meant to be shouted. They must be whispered, even to oneself." He blew out the lamp. In the darkness, the city slept, but Cassius knew that somewhere beneath its marble bones, the feast still waited, and that the philosopher's warning had only just begun to unfold. Rome was never silent, not even at dawn. Even when the first light brushed across the marble roofs, there were sounds. A cart rolling down a distant street, a woman sweeping her doorstep, a boy chasing a dog through the mist. Cassius stood by his window, watching the light crawl up the wall like a slow golden tide. He hadn't slept, not really. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the philosopher's face, calm yet burdened, and heard again the warning. Truth is a flame that warms, but it burns those who keep it too long. By midday, the streets were alive again. Rome's rhythm had returned. Shouts, laughter, the clang of coins. Yet Cassius sensed something different beneath it, like a faint discord in a familiar melody. People spoke softer than usual. Groups broke apart when strangers walked by. Something had changed. He made his way toward the market square, parchment rolls tucked under his arm. Near the fountain where marble lions spat water into a stone basin, he saw Livia, the tavern keeper's daughter, the same woman who had smiled at him during his first night at the Resting Laurel. She was arranging amphorae outside her father's stall, her sleeves rolled, her hair tied with a strip of red cloth. When she saw Cassius, her expression lifted slightly, then dimmed. "You heard?" she asked softly, before he could even greet her. "Heard what?" Her eyes flicked toward a pair of men walking past, then back to him. She lowered her voice. "Marcus, the poet from the feast. He's gone." Cassius froze. "Gone where?" Livia shook her head. "No one knows. His home near the Tiber was found empty this morning. Scrolls, ink, everything vanished. His neighbors said he left before dawn, but..." She hesitated. "The guards were there before sunrise." Cassius felt a slow chill crawl through his chest. Why would the guards? "Because someone reported him," Livia said. "Said he'd been reciting forbidden verses at the feast." He stared at her. "You mean the gathering has been discovered?" She gave a tiny shake of her head. "Not yet. But people are whispering. Someone there might have been listening, not for words, but for names." Cassius felt his pulse thudding in his ears. He remembered the philosopher's warning. Not all who raise their cups do so in friendship. Now the meaning was painfully clear. He leaned closer. "Who reported him?" Livia's voice dropped to a whisper. "No one knows. But they say the name was given to the city prefect before sunrise. And now the prefect's men are searching for others who attended." Cassius swallowed. "Others?" She met his eyes. "People like you. That evening, Cassius walked through the streets with his hood pulled low. The city that had once felt endless now seemed full of corners, shadows, eyes. Every torchlight flicker looked like a signal. Every laugh from a tavern doorway sounded like a test. He told himself he was being paranoid. Rome was vast. No one cared about one quiet scribe. But the philosopher's words would not leave him. He turned down a narrow lane, past a bakery that smelled faintly of ash and bread, and arrived at the door of the philosopher's home, a small, vine-covered dwelling near the old aqueduct. He knocked once, silence, twice, still nothing. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. The old man stood there, robe loose at his shoulders, lamp in hand. He looked as if he had aged 10 more years overnight. "I thought you might come," he said quietly. Cassius stepped inside. "You heard about Marcus?" The philosopher nodded once. "Yes, and I fear he will not be the last." Cassius closed the door behind him. Why him? He only spoke poetry. He wasn't dangerous. The old man set the lamp on the table. The light trembled, throwing soft shadows on the plaster walls. "In Rome," he said, "beauty can be more dangerous than anger. Words that move hearts are harder to silence than swords." He sat down, motioning for Cassius to join him. "The feast is not what it seems. It began as a gathering of dreamers, yes, philosophers, artists, thinkers. But now, too many of its voices speak of reform, of truth, of freedom, and those who watch from above." He gestured toward the ceiling, as if pointing at the Senate beyond. "They hear everything." Cassius leaned forward. "Then we're all in danger." The philosopher gave a tired sigh. "Only those who believe that Rome can change. And you, Cassius, you are one of them." Cassius hesitated. "I only wanted to write, to understand." "That," the old man said softly, "is how revolutions begin." Later, Cassius wandered back into the night. The moon hung pale over the rooftops. Somewhere, a dog barked, and the city murmured in its sleep. As he passed the resting laurel, he saw Livia again, sweeping the floor just inside the door. When she looked up, her eyes were full of quiet worry. He entered. "Livia," he said gently, "did Marcus ever speak to you after the feast?" She nodded slowly. "He left a note for someone. I think it was meant for you." She reached beneath the counter and drew out a small folded parchment, sealed with a drop of red wax. The seal was broken, the wax cracked. Cassius opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably Marcus's, flowing, elegant, hurried. "Cassius, if they find me gone, know that the feast is only one of many. There are others, hidden deeper still. Look where the lamps never burn, beneath the baths of Caracalla. And trust no one who speaks too kindly of Rome." Cassius's hand trembled. He looked up, but Livia's gaze was steady. "Do you know what it means?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not yet." Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, strange for a Roman night. Livia leaned closer. "Be careful, Cassius. People vanish for less." He managed a faint smile. "I'll be careful. I'm only a scribe." But as he stepped into the dark street again, he knew that wasn't true anymore. The ink on his hands felt heavier now, not the ink of words, but of secrets. And in the quiet hum of the night, the city seemed to whisper his name. By dawn, Rome's streets were washed with soft gray light again. The rumors would spread faster than any scroll. The poet's disappearance, the whispers of rebellion, the silent watchers in the crowd. And far beneath the city, in a chamber lit by a single torch, Someone new unrolled Marcus's empty scrolls, reading the spaces between the lines. The night in Rome had grown dangerous, and for thinkers like Cassius, the real darkness had only just begun. The baths of Caracalla loomed like a sleeping giant at the edge of the city, vast, crumbling, and echoing with the ghosts of Rome's forgotten grandeur. By day, the place was still alive with the hum of citizens bathing, merchants selling oils, and old men gossiping in the steam. But by night, the air changed. The pools fell silent, the marble floors cooled, and the wind whispered through the hollow arches like a restless spirit that had lost its home. Cassius arrived after dusk, moving quietly through the shadows of the colonnade. The moon cast long white shapes across the mosaic tiles, heroes, gods, and beasts frozen in battle beneath his feet. Marcus's message echoed in his mind. Look where the lamps never burn, beneath the baths of Caracalla. He found a rusted gate near the southern wall, half buried behind ivy and thyme. It creaked open with the soft sigh of metal surrendering to memory. Beyond it, a narrow stair spiraled downward into darkness. Cassius lit a small oil lamp. The flame trembled like a living heartbeat in his hand. The air grew colder with every step. The smell of the upper world, bread, wine, smoke, faded away, replaced by the damp breath of earth and stone. At the base of the stairs lay a corridor carved from rock. Roman brick met ancient foundation layers of civilization built on top of older bones. He walked slowly, the lamp lighting fragments of murals on the walls, faded figures, perhaps gods or philosophers, painted long ago in ochre and gold. One of them, a man with a scroll and a crown of laurel, seemed to watch him as he passed. After what felt like an hour, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. The ceiling arched high above him, supported by worn marble pillars. Between them burned low fires in iron bowls, each surrounded by men and women cloaked in dark robes. Some read from scrolls, others murmured to one another in tones too soft to follow. It was not a place of worship, nor of rebellion. It was something stranger, quieter, a gathering of minds that had slipped beneath the world, as if hiding from its noise. Cassius stepped closer. One of the figures turned. The hood fell back, revealing a woman with streaks of silver in her hair and sharp, steady eyes. "You followed the poet's trail," she said. Her voice was calm, not surprised, only resigned. "You are Cassius." He nodded slowly. "And you call me Celine," she said. "We knew Marcus would not return, but he sent another seeker in his place." Cassius frowned. "You knew he was gone." She looked toward the fires. Marcus was brave, but he spoke too loudly in a world that rewards silence. Her words echoed in the chamber, where even whispers seemed to linger. He looked around. "What is this place?" Celine gestured to the people seated along the stone benches. The remnants of a greater circle, philosophers, physicians, scholars, even senators who once dared to think differently. When the empire silenced free thought, we came here. Beneath the city, beneath history. She led him to the center of the hall, where a table of black stone stood etched with faint symbols. Upon it lay a single parchment, sealed with wax. "This," she said, "is what Marcus died protecting." Cassius reached for it. The seal bore a strange emblem, not Roman, but older, a sun within a circle, its rays spiraling outward like a labyrinth. "What is it?" he asked softly. Celine met his gaze. "The original charter of the Societas, luminous, the Society of Light. A declaration written centuries ago, before emperors, before conquest. It speaks of a Rome built not by force, but by understanding, a city ruled by wisdom, not fear. Cassius felt his chest tighten, and the Senate forbade it. They buried it, Selene replied, because ideas like this threaten power. If the people knew Rome's foundation was not divine but human, they might stop bowing. She looked down at the parchment with something like sorrow. Every century we protect it. Every century they try to erase it. The firelight flickered across their faces, painting the air with gold and shadow. Cassius whispered, "Why tell me this?" Selene studied him for a long moment. "Because you still believe words can save the world." Marcus did too. And now his silence will speak louder than his poems. She placed the parchment in his hands. The wax seal felt warm, as if it still held the heartbeat of those who wrote it. "You must take this to the old library near the Forum," she said. "Before the Prefect's men reach the tunnels, they have already begun searching. When they find us." Her voice faded. Cassius nodded. "I'll go now." Selene gave him a faint, sad smile. "Then go quietly. The Empire forgets slowly, but it never forgives." He left through another passage, guided by Selene's torchlight, until he reached a narrow archway where roots crept through the stones. The tunnel rose gradually, the air growing lighter, touched by the scent of rain. When he emerged, it was near the edge of the Palatine Hill. The city stretched before him, endless, glimmering under the last breath of night. He stood there for a long time, feeling the parchment against his chest. Above him, the stars began to fade, one by one. Below, Rome began to stir, a beast waking from its dreams. Cassius turned toward the Forum, the scroll hidden beneath his cloak. Behind him, deep beneath the baths, the fires of the hidden philosophers burned low, and somewhere, in the echoing dark, a voice began to recite, softly, the same lines Marcus had whispered at the feast. "Truth walks not in daylight, but in the quiet between steps, where courage meets silence, and silence learns to speak." That night, as Rome's streets filled once more with merchants and laughter, none noticed the lone figure crossing the square beneath the dawn light. Cassius had vanished from the city's stories, but in the shadows beneath its stones, a whisper was growing stronger. It was not rebellion, it was remembrance, and sometimes that was enough to shake an empire. The morning mist clung to Rome like a ghost unwilling to leave. Dew shimmered on rooftops, and the streets glowed with a dull silver light that made even the marble statues look half alive. Cassius moved through the narrow alleys beneath his cloak, the hidden scroll pressed against his chest. Each step echoed softly, the kind of sound that vanishes before it's heard. Above him, the great dome of the Pantheon caught the early sun, golden and calm. But beneath that beauty, the city had changed. The whispers had begun. Word of the forbidden philosophers spread through the streets like dry straw catching a spark. The prefect's guards were questioning scholars, raiding the homes of poets, burning scrolls that dared to question Rome's glory. Cassius felt the tension in the air, thick, invisible, waiting to ignite. He turned a corner and nearly collided with a young bookseller who was hurriedly boarding up his stall. "Leaving so soon?" Cassius asked softly. The man froze. His eyes darted toward the soldiers passing in the distance. "They burned the Forum's northern library last night," he whispered. "Said it was filled with treacherous writings." Cassius's stomach turned cold. "The Forum." The bookseller nodded. "They say the fire started in the Philosopher's quarter, but others say it was no accident. They want us to forget." He looked down, his voice trembling. "They want silence." Cassius thanked him quietly and continued toward the Forum, the chill of dread walking beside him. The Forum had always been the heart of Rome, where voices once rose like songs between marble columns, where senators debated and thinkers shared their words with pride. But now, as Cassius reached the edge of the square, smoke still curled from the ruins of the northern hall. Blackened stone, ash where scrolls had been. The scent of charred parchment hung in the air like a warning. He moved through the crowd that had gathered. Vendors, slaves, and soldiers stood in uneasy silence, watching the aftermath. A line of guards kept people back as workers doused the remaining embers. Among them stood the prefect himself, tall, severe, eyes like cold steel. Cassius ducked his head and stepped into the shadows of a column. He recognized the prefect's voice immediately, sharp, carrying authority, even over the crackle of dying flames. "This is what happens," the prefect said, "when men believe knowledge is greater than obedience. Rome has survived because it knows when to destroy." The crowd murmured, fearful. Cassius felt the scroll beneath his cloak, the one truth that could undo everything the prefect stood for. But now, the question pressed against his thoughts like a blade. Where could he take it? The library was gone. The philosophers were in hiding, and Rome itself was turning against its thinkers. He left the Forum as quietly as he'd come, slipping through the back alleys toward the Tiber River. The city around him seemed louder now, the sound of hammers, soldiers shouting, carts rolling over cobblestones. But under it all was something else, a hum of fear. As he crossed a small bridge, Cassius saw two soldiers dragging a man by the arms. The man's robe was torn, his hands ink-stained. "A scholar, maybe," one of the soldiers barked, "another who thinks too much." Then, to the other, "Burn what he carried." They tossed a bundle of scrolls into a brazier near the bridge. The parchment curled and blackened, words turning to smoke before they could even be read. Cassius looked away, his chest tight. In that moment, he understood what Marcus and Selene had meant, that the empire was not only destroying people, but erasing memory itself. Rome was rewriting the truth by firelight. He followed the river until the sun began to dip again. The water caught the colors of evening gold, fading to crimson, then deep blue. At last, he reached the crumbling remains of an old temple, one long abandoned to ivy and silence. He slipped inside. Dust floated like tiny stars in the air. There, among the shadows, stood an old man arranging clay tablets. His hair was white, his hands steady, and his eyes, when he turned, were kind. "Cassius," he said, as if he had been expecting him. Cassius froze. "How do you know my name?" The man smiled faintly. "Marcus told me long ago that another would come, one who still believed in words." He gestured toward a wooden chest by the altar. "You came for this." Cassius opened the chest. Inside were dozens of scrolls, carefully wrapped in linen. Each bore the same mark as the one he carried, the circle and sun of the Societas Luminis. "The hidden library," Cassius whispered. "It still exists." The man nodded slowly, "Not as it once did. We keep what we can, where we can. Every thinker in Rome who vanishes leaves behind a piece of the light, and we keep it alive." He looked at Cassius's eyes, glimmering in the dim light. "But now the fire has reached the Forum. Soon, even we must go deeper." Cassius hesitated. "Then what should I do?" The man placed a hand on his shoulder. "You carry something precious, not because it changes Rome, but because it remembers what Rome forgot. hide it, guard it, and wait. Empires burn faster than ideas. That night, Cassius sat beneath the temple's broken arch, watching the city lights shimmer across the river. Somewhere in the distance, he could still see smoke rising from the forum. He thought of Marcus, of Selene, of the faces in the hidden chambers beneath the baths. He thought of every poet whose voice had been silenced, and every listener who had dared to dream. The wind brushed against him like a whisper. Truth walks not in daylight. He smiled faintly, finishing the line under his breath. But in the quiet between steps, the stars trembled in the sky, and for the first time, Cassius did not feel alone. The fire in the forum had not destroyed the idea. It had only carried it upward, in smoke, in memory, in whispers. And sometimes that was how all great revolutions began. The night was soft over Rome, that kind of hush that settles after the city exhales. The fires in the forum had finally gone out, leaving the air heavy with the scent of ash and secrets. Cassius sat beneath the broken arch of the old temple, his cloak drawn close against the chill. The stars above looked distant, like old memories trying to be remembered. The old man's words still echoed in his mind. Empires burn faster than ideas. Now, in the silence, Cassius realized how right he was. Rome burned its enemies, its books, its thinkers, but never the questions that outlived them. He stood and followed the old man deeper into the temple. They passed crumbling pillars covered in moss, faded carvings of gods whose names no one spoke anymore. The air smelled of damp stone and candle wax. At the far end of the chamber, the old man knelt before a worn marble statue of Minerva, goddess of wisdom, and pressed his palm against the base. A faint click echoed. Then, with a groan like a sigh, the floor beneath them began to shift. Stone slid against stone, revealing a dark stairway descending into the earth. A breath of cold air rose from below, old air, still carrying the scent of parchment and time. "Come," the old man said quietly. "You've come this far. You deserve to see what Rome tried to bury." Cassius followed, the light of the torch flickering across the rough walls. The staircase spiraled downward endlessly, as if descending into another world. Finally, they reached the bottom, and Cassius froze. Before him stretched a vast cavern, lit by hundreds of oil lamps hanging from chains. The walls were lined with shelves carved directly into the rock, each packed tight with scrolls, clay tablets, and wooden codices. A faint mist hung in the air, and the sound of trickling water echoed from unseen springs. It was like stepping into the lungs of time itself, where every breath carried the weight of forgotten ages. The old man's voice was almost reverent. "Welcome to the Lumen Arcanum, the hidden library." Cassius stepped forward slowly. His fingers brushed a stack of scrolls tied with golden thread, each marked with symbols he didn't recognize. "These writings," Cassius whispered, "they're older than the Republic. Some of these scripts, they aren't even Latin." The old man smiled faintly. "They're not. Some are Greek, others Egyptian, some older still." He picked up a clay tablet and held it to the light. Strange markings shimmered faintly across its surface. "Before Rome," he said, "there were others who sought to understand the world, who asked the same questions about life, death, and the soul. When empires fell, their knowledge sank with them. We, the society, have gathered what fragments we could. We keep them alive." Cassius felt a slow awe spreading through him. "How far back does it go?" The old man met his eyes. "As far back as the first fire that ever told a story. They moved deeper into the library. Cassius saw scrolls describing the stars, maps of lost cities, records of dreams carved onto ivory. There were writings in languages no man had spoken for 1,000 years, and everywhere the soft rustle of parchment, like whispers of ancient voices. He paused beside a carved archway etched with symbols. "What is this section?" The old man's tone lowered. "Those are the forbidden chronicles, the ones Rome would call heresy." Cassius looked closer. The titles spoke of strange ideas, that the soul is made of light, that the gods were once mortal, that the earth itself remembers. He traced one inscription with his finger. "And you believe these things?" The old man sighed. "Belief is a fragile word. We preserve them not because we know they are true, but because we know what happens when they are lost." He turned, his gaze deep with quiet sadness. "Rome believes it is eternal, but so did every empire before it. The truth is older. It waits beneath the ruins." As they walked, Cassius noticed a small chamber ahead. Inside, a single scroll lay upon a stone pedestal, surrounded by candles. The air there felt different, heavier. He stepped inside. "What is this one?" The old man hesitated. "That," he said finally, "is the reason the society still exists." Cassius approached slowly. The parchment was ancient, but the ink was still sharp and dark. Symbols spiraled across it in a pattern unlike anything he had seen. At its center was a symbol, a circle within another, surrounded by tiny flames. He reached out. The old man's hand shot out, stopping him. "Not yet," he warned softly. "That writing is not meant to be read aloud. It carries something deeper than words. Memory itself." Cassius frowned. "Memory." The old man nodded. "There are those who believe that the first humans did not write their stories. They remembered them perfectly, endlessly. This scroll is said to be one of their last remnants." Cassius looked at him. "You mean before history?" "Yes," the old man said. "Before Rome, before kings, before even the first alphabet." A silence fell between them, thick as stone. Finally, Cassius whispered, "Why show me this?" The old man turned toward the distant shelves, his shadow long in the flickering light. "Because you still believe truth is worth remembering. That's rare in this world." They stood together in the dim light, the soft crackle of oil lamps echoing around them. Cassius felt the strange calm of the place, a peace untouched by empire, untouched by time, and yet beneath it a tremor of something darker. He couldn't shake the feeling that this place was not just hidden, it was protected, or perhaps guarded. He turned to the old man. "How long can this place remain secret?" The old man looked weary. "Not long. Rome's fires will find their way down here, as they always do, but perhaps not in our lifetime." He placed a small bronze amulet in Cassius's hand, the same symbol as the scroll, a circle and flame. "When that day comes," he said quietly, "you'll know what to do." Cassius closed his fingers around the amulet. Its warmth pulsed faintly, as if alive. He didn't yet understand what it meant, but he knew with a strange certainty that this was not the end of his journey. It was only the beginning. Outside, the night deepened over Rome. The Tiber flowed quietly, carrying ashes, secrets, and reflections of stars. And beneath the city, in a cavern of forgotten light, Cassius stood among the ghosts of time, holding the last breath of knowledge that had survived every fire before him. The hidden library slept, and with it, the memory of the world. When Cassius awoke, The oil lamps had burned down to soft embers. The old man was gone. Only the faint hum of the underground library remained, the low breathing of stone and time itself. He sat for a moment in the half-light, feeling the weight of the amulet against his palm. It pulsed faintly, warm, as though remembering a heartbeat not his own. He slipped the amulet around his neck, secured the scroll he carried beneath his cloak, and began the long climb upward through the spiral stair. Each step echoed softly, like drops of memory rising toward the world above. When he finally pushed open the hidden door, morning light poured in, bright and golden, too sharp for eyes that had just seen the dark. Rome was awake, but something was wrong. The air was thick with smoke again. Shouts echoed from the streets. Somewhere far off, a bell clanged, not the gentle call of the market, but the hard, urgent toll of alarm. Cassius stepped out into the ruins of the temple courtyard. The ivy had been torn from the walls. Boot prints and broken torches lay scattered across the ground, and on the steps a smear of blood. His heart tightened. Someone had been here. He ducked into the shadows of an archway as voices neared. Two soldiers appeared, helmets glinting, their crimson cloaks darkened with soot. Prefect's orders, one said. Search every ruin near the river. We found one of them trying to flee last night, called himself a scribe, and the others? Asked the second. The first man spat on the ground. Gone. Vanished into the catacombs, maybe, but we'll find them. The prefect says these philosophers are hiding scrolls that insult the gods. Treason by ink. They moved off toward the Forum Road, boots scraping against the stones. Cassius waited until the sound faded, then exhaled quietly. His pulse hammered in his ears. So the prefect knew the hunt had begun. He touched the edge of the scroll beneath his cloak, as though to make sure it was still real. The old man had said it carried memory itself, something deeper than writing. Now it was also a death sentence. He slipped into the city's back streets, keeping his hood low. The Rome he saw that morning did not feel like home. Where once laughter had echoed from the taverns, now there was silence. The stalls of booksellers were empty. The statue of Minerva in the square was blackened from fire, and everywhere notices nailed to walls. All unauthorized writings to be surrendered to the prefect. Those found in possession shall be punished as enemies of Rome. Cassius passed them without slowing, but his breath grew tight. It was happening faster than anyone had feared. Rome was erasing itself, word by word. He turned down a narrow alley leading to the house of Marcus, his old friend, the one who had first shown him the tunnels beneath the baths. But when he reached the door, he stopped. The door was hanging open. Inside, the room was wrecked, scrolls torn apart, ink spilled like blood, and on the floor, Marcus's writing tablet cracked in two. Cassius knelt beside it, his hands trembling. The faint scent of smoke lingered here, too. Then he saw it, scratched hastily into the wood. The river remembers. A message. A clue. Marcus had left it for him. Cassius rose and slipped out the back before the soldiers could return. He knew where to go. The river Tiber wound through Rome like a dark ribbon, carrying secrets that never surfaced. At dusk, the banks were quiet, only the creak of barges and the splash of oars in the distance. Cassius followed the current until he reached the narrow arches beneath the Bridge of Sighs. There, hidden by shadow and moss, a small grate opened into a drain, one he and Marcus had once used to hide banned scrolls. Years ago, he knelt, reached inside, and felt nothing. The space was empty. Then his hand brushed something hard, a bronze cylinder. He pulled it out, wiped the grime away, and opened it. Inside was a single parchment, smaller than the one he carried. The handwriting was Marcus's, rough, hurried, as if written in flight. Cassius, the prefect knows about the society. They took Celine. The library will not remain hidden long. If you still have the memory scroll, hide it. The amulet you wear is the key. Do not trust the priests. Remember, the river remembers. Cassius's throat tightened. Celine captured the library in danger. He read the lines again, then looked down at the amulet, glowing faintly against his chest. A key, Marcus had said. But a key to what? Footsteps sounded above the bridge. Shouts, torches. Cassius froze. The prefect's men, their voices carried over the water. Check the banks, one ordered. He was seen near the temple ruins. Cassius slipped into the shadows, his sandals sinking into the damp earth. He tucked both scrolls beneath his cloak and moved silently along the river's edge. The torches flared behind him, casting gold light across the black water. Then a sharp whistle. They'd seen him, by order of the prefect. A voice shouted, "Stop." Cassius didn't stop. He ran, down the embankment, through reeds and mud, his breath ragged in the cold air. Behind him came the pounding of boots, the clatter of armor. He veered toward the nearest arch, an old drainage tunnel that led beneath the city. He ducked inside, just as an arrow clattered against the stone beside his head. Darkness swallowed him whole. The tunnel was narrow, damp, echoing with the slow drip of water. He could barely see, but he knew these tunnels, the forgotten veins of Rome, older than the empire itself. He moved deeper, the torchlight behind him fading, until all that remained was the sound of his own breathing. At last he reached a hollow where the tunnel widened into a cistern. He knelt by the edge of the dark pool and unwrapped the scroll. The markings shimmered faintly, alive in the torchlight, and when he brought the amulet close, it pulsed. The water rippled faintly at first, then stronger, as if something beneath it had stirred. Reflections danced across the walls, fragments of faces, voices, flashes of light, a memory, not written, living. The scroll was showing him something, though he couldn't yet understand it. Ancient cities, stars over deserts, people riding by firelight, the first stories. Then, as suddenly as it began, the glow faded. The pool grew still again. Cassius sat back, trembling. He realized now what Marcus had meant. The river remembers. The scroll was not just a relic. It was the echo of humanity itself. And now Rome was hunting it. He wrapped it carefully once more, hid it inside the cylinder, and tied it to the base of the cistern, deep where no torchlight could reach. Then he whispered softly, "Remember, for me." He stood, his heart heavy but steady. If the prefect wanted to burn knowledge, then knowledge would simply learn to hide deeper. It always had. And as Cassius disappeared into the dark, the last glimmer of light from the amulet faded beneath the water, where it would wait, silent and eternal, until the world was ready to listen again. The first thing Cassius felt was the stone beneath his cheek, cold, rough, and damp. The second was the iron taste of blood at the corner of his mouth. Somewhere above, torches hissed and boots scraped the floor. He tried to lift his head, but his arms were bound. Chains, thick ones, fastened at his wrists and ankles. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and wine, the scent of Roman power. He was no longer beneath the city. He was inside the heart of it. A voice echoed softly from the shadows. "Cassius Vero," it said, "scholar of the Senate, student of forbidden books, messenger of ghosts." Cassius blinked, trying to focus. The torches brightened. A tall man stepped forward, his armor black, trimmed with gold. The prefect, Lucius Severian, the man whose name had haunted the whispers of Rome for months, the hunter of philosophers, the torchbearer of the emperor's new law, and now the one standing above him. The prefect studied him silently for a moment, then nodded to the guards. They lifted Cassius to his knees and stepped back. Lucius approached slowly, his boots ringing against the marble. In his hand, he held something small, a bronze chain. Cassius's heart sank. The amulet. You hid it well, Lucius said quietly, turning it in his fingers. But not well enough. He stopped just in front of Cassius and crouched. Their eyes met, and to Cassius's surprise, there was no hatred there, only weariness. You look like a man who's seen ghosts, the prefect murmured. Cassius said nothing. Lucius smiled faintly, or perhaps remembered them. The prefect rose and began to pace. You know, he said, once, long ago, I too believed in what you call the Society of Memory. Cassius's head lifted slightly. Lucius stopped, his gaze distant. Before the wars, before the emperor's reforms, I was a student, like you, hungry for meaning. I read the old scrolls, the ones that spoke of knowledge older than Rome. He held up the amulet, and I wore one of these. Cassius's breath caught. You, Lucius nodded. Yes, we were dreamers then, believers. We thought truth was something we could protect. But truth, Cassius, he turned slowly, eyes cold now. Truth is not protection, it's fire, and fire burns everything. He leaned closer, his voice low. I learned that the night they found the library of Aurelian, I watched my friends dragged into the streets. I watched scrolls burn until the sky turned black. I survived because I betrayed no one, and I swore I would never let that chaos return. Cassius swallowed, his throat dry. You mean you destroyed what you once loved? Lucius's jaw tightened. I preserved what could be saved, the empire itself. The empire, Cassius said softly. Or your comfort. The prefect's hand shot out, gripping Cassius's chin hard. Careful, Lucius said. You speak as though you know what Rome needs. Cassius met his gaze. Rome needs memory. Without it, she's just stone and blood. Lucius studied him for a long time, then released him. You sound like I once did, he murmured. It will get you killed, you. He turned toward the guards. Leave us, they hesitated, then bowed and exited, the heavy door closing behind them. The chamber fell into silence. Lucius poured wine from a silver jug, filled 2 cups, and handed one to Cassius. Cassius stared at it, untrusting. Lucius chuckled softly. Poison? No. If I wanted you dead, you'd already be gone. Drink. Cassius hesitated, then took a slow sip. The wine was bitter, strong, the kind that burned as it went down. Lucius raised his own cup to the old days when we thought words could change the world. For a moment, they drank in silence. The prefect looked almost human, not the executioner Cassius had imagined, but a man carrying the ashes of something he once believed in. At last, Lucius spoke again. I know what you found, he said quietly. The scroll, the tunnels, the library, it's all true. The society lives beneath us still. Cassius's breath slowed. You know, and yet you destroy them. Lucius's eyes hardened, because the knowledge they guard is not meant for men. It was hidden for a reason. He set down his cup and drew closer. There are things written in those scrolls, caches, prophecies, designs, memories that do not belong to this age. The Empire must not be burdened with them. Cassius shook his head. You're afraid of ideas. Lucius's voice sharpened. I'm afraid of ruin. Empires do not fall to swords. They fall to words. And words like yours are sharper than steel. The prefect turned, pacing again. Tell me, where is it? The memory scroll. I know you had it. Cassius hesitated. The silence stretched. Lucius's hand drifted to the dagger at his belt. You think you can protect it, he said. You think you're saving Rome. You're only delaying the inevitable. Tell me where it is, and I may yet spare you. Cassius lifted his head, voice calm. It's where the river remembers. Lucius stopped. The faintest flicker crossed his face, recognition. So, you used the old code, he said softly. Then you know what it means. He turned, walking toward the torch rack. For a long time, he said nothing. Then I had hoped you would join me, Cassius. You have the mind of a scholar, the courage of a fool, and the heart of a believer. Rome could use men like you, if only you'd kneel. Cassius smiled faintly, tiredly. I don't kneel to fear. Lucius exhaled, almost sadly. Then you'll die for memory. He gestured to the guards outside. Take him to the lower cells. We'll see how long conviction lasts without light. They dragged Cassius through corridors that smelled of earth and rust. Downward, always downward. He heard the door slam behind him and chains rattle into place. The cell was small, lit only by the faint flicker of a torch through the bars. Water dripped from the ceiling, slow and steady. Cassius leaned back against the wall, every muscle aching. He thought of Marcus, of Selene, of the library beneath the earth, and of the scroll resting in the river's quiet memory. He smiled faintly, closing his eyes. Lucius might think he D1, but Rome's memory was far older than either of them. And as Cassius drifted into uneasy sleep, he dreamed of voices whispering beneath the water, promising that the truth was not lost, only waiting. At first, Cassius thought it was the dripping water, soft, steady, eternal, a single drop, echoing through the silence of his cell, like the ticking of an unseen clock. But as the hours passed, or perhaps days, he no longer knew. The sound began to change. The droplets whispered not in any language he could name, not with words he could fully understand, but in a rhythm that tugged at something deep within his mind, something older than memory itself. The cell was dark now, lit only by a faint blue shimmer that shouldn't have been there. Cassius lifted his head weakly. The water that pooled at the base of the wall was glowing, faint, like moonlight caught beneath glass. He crawled toward it, the chains around his wrists scraping softly. When he touched the surface, the light pulsed once, as if it recognized him. He stared, entranced. The whispers grew clearer. 1,000 voices, soft, patient, filled with memory. Cassius. He froze. The voice had shape now, a tone, familiar. He leaned closer. Marcus, he whispered. The water rippled, and the sound of his old friend's laughter, low and kind, filled the cell like a ghost of air. Do not fear the silence, brother. The memory watches still. Cassius's heart trembled. You're dead, he whispered. They burned the feast, the library, nothing truly burns. The voice replied gently. Knowledge finds a vessel. The glow shifted, forming shapes, a hand, then a symbol, the spiral mark of the society. It shimmered just beneath the surface of the water, before fading again into light. Cassius sat back, breath uneven. Was it real? Had hunger and loneliness finally cracked his mind? He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe slowly, the way Marcus had taught him during their late-night debates. Reason before wonder, Marcus used to say. Even mystery has a pulse, but reason had no place here. Not in this cell, not in this whispering blue glow that spoke of rivers and memory. He lay down, exhausted, his cheek pressed to the cold stone, and then sleep came. Not the deep, dreamless kind, but something stranger. He found himself standing on the banks of the Tiber, the river stretching endlessly before him like a ribbon of light. The air shimmered, and from the mist rose figures, cloaked, hooded, their hands clasped in silent reverence. He recognized them, the society, the same faces he had seen in the feast hall and the tunnels below the baths, though now they glowed faintly, as though made of the same light as the water. One of them stepped forward. Her voice was soft and echoing, like the current itself. Cassius Varro, the river remembers you. He tried to speak, but his voice failed. The woman raised a hand, and the sound of rushing water filled his ears. You have carried the memory beyond fear. The Prefect cannot silence what has been written in the current. You are the bridge between forgetting and remembrance. Cassius felt warmth spread through him, gentle, steady, endless. But you are not yet free, she continued. The Empire still fears the light below, and until one voice rises to remind them, the river will remain chained. He looked around at the glowing figures. How, he managed to say, how do I rise from beneath stone and iron? The woman smiled faintly. Water finds a way. He awoke with a start. The glow was gone. The cell was silent, but the air felt different, lighter, almost breathing with him. He turned toward the wall, and his eyes widened. The water had carved something into the stone overnight, delicate lines that shimmered faintly in the dark. A map. He traced it with his fingers. It wasn't a full layout, just a pattern, a winding path leading toward what looked like a river bend, the Tiber. He understood then what the dream had meant. The society's secret path was older than the tunnels, older even than the city. It was the river itself, the keeper of Rome's true memory. Cassius rose slowly, his body trembling from exhaustion, but driven now by purpose. He tugged at the chains on his wrists. They didn't give, but the wall, the damp wall where the water pooled, seemed softer than before. Centuries of moisture had weakened the stone. He began to work, steady and silent, chipping at it with the edge of a broken shackle. Hours passed, maybe days. Time dissolved like sand. Every so often he'd pause, pressing his ear against the rock, and he'd hear it, the faint, pulsing whisper of the river on the other side. Finally, the stone gave way. A narrow crack, then an opening just wide enough to slip through. Cold air flooded the cell, carrying with it the scent of night and running water. Cassius took one last look behind him at the chains, the darkness, the place where he'd nearly lost his mind. Then he stepped into the tunnel. The passage was old, older than any Roman work he'd ever seen. Its walls were curved, carved by nature, not hands. And as he walked, the faint blue glow returned, guiding him like a quiet star. The whispers grew louder now, but no longer frightening. They were familiar, comforting, like 1,000 scholars, speaking softly through time. He felt them all around him, the poets, the thinkers, the dreamers Rome had silenced, their voices merging into one endless current. Keep walking, Cassius. He smiled faintly, whispering back, I am. The tunnel opened into a vast underground cavern. Before him stretched the true Tiber, not the river above that carried ships and politics, but its ancient heart, still untouched by the empire's reach. The water gleamed with living light, and at its center stood a small stone altar, half-sunken, covered in symbols of the old world. Cassius waded forward until he reached it. He placed his hand upon the stone, and the whispering stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then, slowly, words filled his mind, not from outside, but from within. You are the vessel now. Carry the memory. Let it flow again. The water rippled, the glow deepened, and somewhere far above, in the Prefect's chamber, a cup of wine shattered, as though the river itself had spoken against tyranny. Cassius closed his eyes. He could feel it, the weight of centuries, the breath of all who came before. And he understood at last that memory was not to be kept, it was to be released. He whispered into the current, his voice merging with the flow for those who were silenced. Let them speak again. The river answered, gentle and endless. And for the first time since the library burned, Rome dreamed again. The water was colder now. It ran along Cassius's fingers like liquid glass, tracing the faint veins on his skin. Each step through the tunnel felt both heavier and lighter, as though the weight of the world was slowly washing away. He didn't know how long he had been walking. There was no light save for the ghostly blue glow that seemed to follow him, the same mysterious shimmer that had guided him through the cell wall. Every drip of water echoed like a heartbeat in the dark. Somewhere behind him, deep in the catacombs of Rome, the empire still slept, but not for long, because somewhere far above, in the Prefect's chamber, the air had begun to tremble. The Prefect stood alone, the cup of shattered wine still staining the marble floor. He stared at it, at the crimson spreading like blood across white stone, and for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, fear. He pressed a hand to the table to steady himself. The tremor had come suddenly, a vibration through the walls, faint but undeniable. He knew that sound. He had felt it once before, long ago, in the tunnels of Caracalla, when he too had stood among philosophers who spoke of memory as something living. He thought they were all gone. He had made sure of it. But now the river was moving again. Deep below, Cassius reached a split in the tunnels. One path led upward, toward faint air and possible freedom. The other descended further into darkness, where the whisper of water grew stronger. He hesitated. The whisper, the same soft voice that had guided him from the cell, seemed to hum faintly at his left. Downstream, it said, as if carried by the current itself. The river remembers. He followed. The tunnel widened, curving into a hidden chamber. The walls were etched with carvings, thousands of tiny symbols, worn by centuries of water. He ran his fingers along them, and as his touch moved, each symbol glowed faintly for a moment before fading again. They weren't letters, they were moments, memories etched into the rock itself. He saw flashes, the founding of Rome, the first priests of the river, the poets who whispered beneath the baths, and the day the society buried its final scrolls beneath the flow of the Tiber. Cassius felt a rush of emotion, awe, sorrow, belonging. This was no escape route. It was the river's mind. He took a deep breath, kneeling beside the water. His reflection rippled, but it wasn't his face that looked back. He saw Marcus, the philosopher, the missing poet, all of them layered within the flow. The empire can chain bodies, the voice whispered, but not remembrance. Cassius closed his eyes. Then teach me, he murmured. Teach me how to remember. The water stilled. A pulse ran through the floor, a hum so low he could feel it in his bones. When he opened his eyes, the carvings had shifted. Now they formed a single path, glowing softly, leading toward a small gate of iron. Meanwhile, above the city, the prefect walked through the silent halls of his villa. The moonlight cut through the windows like blades. He could still feel the tremor faint beneath his feet, as if the ground itself was whispering secrets. He called for his guard, "Captain, search the lower chambers, every tunnel that runs beneath the river. If the prisoner is not in chains, then he is in the current." The captain hesitated. "My lord, the tunnels are not mapped. The river shifts. Men who go there then send those who are not afraid to die," the prefect snapped. "Because if the river wakes, so does the truth, and truth has never been kind to power." He turned to the window, staring out at the sleeping city. Rome's rooftops glowed faintly under the moon. He whispered to himself, almost tenderly, "You can bury wisdom, but you cannot drown it." Cassius reached the gate. It was rusted, half-sunken, and older than any Roman ironwork he had ever seen. The water pressed against it like a heartbeat, urging him forward. He braced his hands against the metal. It didn't move. Then he saw it, a faint mark carved into the stone beside it, the spiral of the society. He pressed his palm to it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a surge. The gate shuddered, the water behind it rising with sudden force. Cassius stumbled back as the iron split open and a wave burst through, sweeping him into the flow. The cold bit into his skin, the current spinning him through tunnels that twisted and roared like the inside of a storm. He gasped for air, but the water felt alive. It held him, carried him, protected him, and through it all, he heard the whisper again. "You are not escaping. You are becoming." When he finally surfaced, it was night. He gasped, blinking against the soft silver light of the moon. He was floating in the open Tiber. The city stretched before him like a sleeping giant. Behind him, the tunnel mouth poured its water quietly back into the river, as though nothing had ever happened. Cassius swam to the shore, collapsing on the muddy bank. The sound of distant music drifted from the tavern's laughter, the clink of cups, the hum of a city that never truly slept. He stared up at the stars, breathing hard, the night wind cool on his face. He was free. But the river's whisper had not left him. It moved now through his thoughts, calm and steady, like blood through veins. "The prefect will seek you, but Rome will remember you. The current has chosen its keeper." He sat up slowly. On the other side of the river, the great marble statues of the Forum seemed to watch him, silent, eternal, bathed in moonlight. He knew what he had to do. The library was gone. The scrolls were ashes. But the memory, the real memory, flowed through him now. Cassius rose to his feet, dripping and exhausted, and whispered to the river, "I will keep it alive. In story, in sleep, in silence." The water shimmered in answer, a single wave brushing against his ankles like a bow. High above, in his villa, the prefect looked down at the same river. He could feel it, a pulse, faint but certain, as if something deep beneath the surface had begun to breathe again. He whispered, almost in reverence, "So the current returns." Then, softly, he added, "Let it come." Cassius began to walk toward the shadows of the city, his cloak heavy, his steps slow. He disappeared into the Roman night, a single soul carrying centuries of forbidden memory. And as the Tiber flowed endlessly beside him, it seemed to hum a lullaby older than Rome itself, a song of remembrance, a story of those who had dared to dream after dark. Rome slept uneasily that night. The wind that moved through her streets carried more than the scent of smoke and river water. It carried whispers, whispers that had no name, yet seemed to belong to every stone, every column, every forgotten courtyard. Cassius walked among them. He kept his hood drawn low, his robe dark with river stains. In one hand he carried a small oil lamp, in the other a satchel of old parchment, scraps of memory he had pieced together from the underground library before the flood had swallowed it. He had not slept since escaping the tunnels. Something inside him was still stirring, the same current that had carried him through the darkness, and now it wanted to speak. He began in the lower districts, where Rome's poorest lived along the banks, fishermen, servants, and builders who labored by day and drank by night to forget their burdens. They were the unseen ones, the silent arteries of the empire. Cassius gathered them near the steps of an old shrine, half collapsed and forgotten by the priests. He lit his lamp and spoke softly. At first, only a few listened. A beggar, a washerwoman, a child holding a broken toy. But then more came, drawn not by his face, but by the rhythm of his voice. He told them of the river before Rome, of the first settlers who spoke to it as a living being, who offered wine and words instead of blood. He told them of how the empire had risen on the river Esbac, how each emperor's triumph was carved from the same stone that once belonged to poets and dreamers. The crowd sat in silence. The firelight trembled over their faces, faces weary, faces lined by years of labor, but softening now with wonder. When he finished, no one clapped. They simply sat there, letting the quiet linger, as if afraid that any sound might wake them from a dream. Then the child spoke. "Tell another," he said. Cassius smiled faintly, the lamplight catching the edge of his eyes. And so he did. Across the city, the prefect's villa stood in stillness. A messenger arrived, out of breath. "My lord, there are gatherings in the lower quarters. Someone is speaking to the crowds. Not rebellion, but stories." The prefect turned from his window. "Stories, yes, my lord, of ancient times. The guards say people listen as though under a spell." The prefect said nothing for a moment. Then, almost gently, "Find him, but do not kill him. The man who stirs dreams is more dangerous than the one who wields a blade. I want to know his name." The stories spread like mist. By dawn, the market sellers whispered them between stalls. By noon, the potters sang fragments while shaping clay. By dusk, even the guards at the city gates could be heard murmuring strange lines of forgotten prayer. Cassius moved from district to district, never staying long, always in motion. He would tell one tale, then vanish before the soldiers arrived, and each time the crowd grew larger. The whispers called him the river's speaker. But Cassius did not seek a name, he only sought remembrance. One evening, as he crossed the narrow bridge near the field of Mars, he saw torches in the distance, soldiers searching. He slipped into a side alley, pressed against the cold wall, and waited. The footsteps passed, heavy, disciplined, unyielding. Then, from the shadows beside him, an old woman spoke. "You walk as one who has seen what others fear." Cassius turned. Her face was thin, her eyes clouded, but not blind. She wore a necklace made of river stones, worn smooth by time. "Do you know the current?" she asked. He hesitated. "I have walked through it." The woman smiled. "Then you are not lost. The river remembers its own." She handed him a clay bowl filled with clear water. "When you tell your stories, pour a drop of this first." The water listens. It carries your words where your feet cannot go. Cassius bowed his head in thanks. When he looked up again, she was gone, as though the night had simply folded around her. That night, Cassius told a story unlike the others. He spoke not of emperors or temples, but of the smallest things: a potter's first fire, a child's laughter on the riverbank, a soldier who dreamed of peace. He spoke until the stars dimmed, and when he poured the last drop of water from the bowl, it shimmered briefly, like light dancing across the river. He could feel it now, the memory spreading. It wasn't just in words. It was in sound, in breath, in silence. Rome was beginning to remember itself, but the prefect could feel it too. He stood by his balcony, watching the Tiber move under the moonlight. The water no longer seemed calm. It rippled against the piers, almost impatiently. He whispered, "You are waking her, aren't you, Cassius?" His voice trembled, not with anger, but with awe. He turned to his captain. "Seal the bridges. No one crosses after nightfall. If he speaks again, I want him brought to me alive." The captain bowed. "And the people, my lord?" "Let them dream," the prefect said quietly. "Dreams are easier to rule than truth." But even he did not sound convinced. By the week's end, Cassius's voice had become a ghost that haunted Rome. Men swore they heard it in the markets, though no one stood there. Children claimed the river whispered stories to them as they slept. Even the priests at the temples began finding old hymns scratched into the dust of their altars, words no one had written for centuries. The city was alive with echoes. The walls themselves seemed to hum with them, and Cassius knew that the stories were no longer his. They belonged to Rome now, to its memory, its silence, its endless hunger for meaning. He sat by the riverbank that night, alone, the oil lamp flickering beside him. He could hear the faint sound of marching, soldiers searching, the prefect's shadow moving ever closer. He did not run. Instead, he dipped his hand into the Tiber, letting the current wrap around his wrist like a ribbon. He whispered one last story, not for the people, not for the prefect, but for the river itself. Once there was a city built upon memory. Its rulers forgot, and it began to die. But one night, the river sang, and the stones remembered their names again. The water shimmered faintly, and a voice answered, soft as breath. "The story is not over." Cassius smiled. He stood, gathering his cloak around him, and stepped into the shadows of the narrow streets once more, a storyteller walking through the dreams of an empire. And as he vanished into the labyrinth of Rome, the city seemed to exhale, long, deep, and alive, as if awakening from centuries of silence. The prefect had not slept for 3 nights. Even when he closed his eyes, the city would not grow silent. He could hear it breathing softly beneath the sound of the wind. Rome, the mighty, the eternal, was whispering. And in those whispers, he sometimes thought he heard a name: Cassius. He sat by the window of his private chamber, the scent of burning cedar heavy in the air. Outside, the forum shimmered beneath the torchlight, rows of statues staring blankly through the smoke of night patrols. The prefect's scribe entered, careful not to disturb him. "My lord," he said, "we have sealed the bridges, searched the markets, even questioned the priests. But the storyteller, he vanishes like mist." The prefect did not answer. He only ran his finger along the rim of his wine cup, deep in thought. "Have you ever tried to catch the wind?" he asked softly. The scribe hesitated. "No, my lord." "Then you know what it feels like to hunt a voice," the prefect murmured. Still, the search continued. By the second day, the guards began raiding taverns where Cassius's name had been whispered. They tore down scrolls, silenced singers, and threatened those who gathered after dusk. But it was already too late. The words had taken root in songs, in stories, in dreams. Even the guards began to mutter strange verses under their breath without realizing it. And the prefect began to feel something unfamiliar, doubt. That night he dreamed again. He stood in the middle of the forum, but the marble pillars were gone. In their place rose massive trees, ancient, gnarled, and silver in the moonlight. The ground shimmered with water, reflecting 1,000 stars that pulsed like living hearts. He heard the river's voice, soft and deep. You tried to bury memory, it said, but memory does not die. It waits beneath the stones. Then he saw Cassius standing across the water, holding a small lamp. "Why are you afraid of what you once believed?" Cassius asked. The prefect wanted to answer, but his voice broke like glass. The dream dissolved into ripples of light. When he awoke, his pillow was damp, as though the river itself had touched him. By morning, his temper was gone. He ordered his men to move faster, to search the tunnels beneath the old aqueducts. They obeyed, though fear clung to them like shadow. The prefect rode at the head of the column, his armor dull with dust. As they passed through the narrow streets, people watched from their doorways, not with anger, but with quiet knowing, as though they already understood the futility of the hunt. A child pointed at him and whispered, "That's the man who lost his voice." The words stung. At the entrance to the ancient aqueduct, the soldiers found traces, footprints, a fragment of burnt parchment, and a drop of wax from a lamp. "He was here," said the captain, "not long ago." The prefect dismounted, kneeling to touch the earth. It was still warm. He looked into the darkness of the tunnel. For a moment, he thought he heard something, not movement, but a soft hum, like distant singing. "Leave torches," he commanded. We go in. The tunnels breathed with the damp air of centuries. Water dripped from the stone ceilings, echoing through endless chambers. The deeper they went, the quieter the soldiers became. Their footsteps slowed, their torches flickered, and soon even the prefect felt as though the walls themselves were listening. He saw faint markings on the stone lines of poetry scratched into the mortar, half-erased by time. Some of them he recognized. He had once copied those same verses as a young man, when he too believed in ideas older than law. Now, seeing them again, he felt something inside him begin to stir, an ache he had buried long ago. Suddenly, a voice came from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here." The soldiers raised their spears. The prefect turned, but it wasn't Cassius. It was Marcus, the old friend who had once walked beside him through the baths, the philosopher who had disappeared months before. His beard was longer, his eyes bright with feverish light. "You're chasing ghosts," Marcus said softly. "Cassius isn't your enemy. He's the echo of what you tried to forget." The prefect frowned. "You speak in riddles." Marcus stepped closer. "No, you've just forgotten how to listen." He handed the prefect a small scroll. "Take this," he said. "When the dream returns, read it aloud. It will remind you who you were." Before the prefect could reply, Marcus melted back into the shadows. The soldiers shouted, searching, but he was gone, as if swallowed by the tunnel itself. That night, back in his villa, the prefect sat alone by the fire. He unrolled the scroll. It was a poem, short, simple, written in the same script as his youth. "When knowledge sleeps, the world forgets. But when memory wakes, even the mighty must listen." He stared at the words until they blurred, and for the first time in years, he whispered to himself, "I remember." Outside, Thunder rolled across the horizon. The Tiber shimmered like molten bronze beneath flashes of lightning. From somewhere in the distance came a single, faint voice telling a story. He couldn't tell if it was real or part of his dream. But the prefect closed his eyes, and for a moment he let himself listen. The hunt was no longer for Cassius. It was for the truth that had slipped away from Rome, the truth he once helped bury. And in that still, silent hour before dawn, as the rain began to fall, he whispered to the empty air, "Tomorrow I will find him, but not to silence him. Tomorrow I will listen." Morning came quietly to Rome. The storm had passed, leaving behind streets washed clean by the night's rain. Columns glistened like pale bones in the rising sun, and the air carried the scent of wet stone and olive leaves. For the first time in many weeks, Cassius walked without fear. He moved through the narrow alleys near the river, his cloak heavy with moisture, his lamp unlit. He no longer needed its light. Somewhere deep within, he felt that the story, his story, was finally coming to its end. The whispers had grown fainter. The secret meetings, the hidden scrolls, the chants beneath the baths, all of it seemed to be fading into something softer, something almost holy. Everywhere he went, people spoke quietly of dreams. Dreams of rivers that spoke in ancient tongues. Dreams of voices rising from marble. Dreams of the city remembering itself. Cassius smiled. The memory had awakened, not as rebellion, but as a gentle stirring of souls. By midday, he reached the forum, now nearly empty, save for a few vendors and doves perched upon the statues. He stood at the center, where he had once listened to philosophers debate truth and gods. The marble beneath his feet was still cracked from the fires of years past. He traced one of the lines with his hand and whispered, "Everything broken still remembers its shape." Then he heard the sound of footsteps. The prefect was standing at the far end of the forum, his armor dull, his face drawn but calm. No guards, no weapons raised, only the sound of the river wind between them. Neither man spoke for a long moment. When the prefect finally broke the silence, his voice was quiet, not commanding, not cruel, but human. "You've been busy, storyteller." Cassius smiled faintly. "I could say the same, prefect." The older man gave a weary laugh. "You've made my city restless. They whisper your tales in the markets, in the barracks, even in my own home." "Then you've heard the truth," Cassius said softly. The prefect walked closer. "Truth," he repeated, as though testing the word. "Once, I thought truth was something I could hold, something to protect or destroy." He stopped beside Cassius and looked out across the square. "Now I'm not so sure." They stood in silence for a while. A breeze passed through the ruins, carrying the scent of rain and the faint sound of temple bells. The prefect spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember the poet Marcus?" Cassius nodded. "He warned me. He saved me. He saved me too," said the prefect. "Long ago, before I forgot who I was." He reached into his cloak and pulled out the scroll Marcus had given him, the one he had read by firelight nights before. The parchment was creased, damp, nearly falling apart. "I read it every night since the tunnels," he said. "It doesn't fade, the words, they stay." He handed it to Cassius. "For you, it belongs with the others." Cassius unrolled the scroll and smiled. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. The prefect shook his head. "It's the first verse of a story that began before Rome," Cassius said softly. "A memory carried in silence, passed from one voice to the next, so that even when empires fall, the story lives on. He looked at the prefect. And now, you're part of it too. The prefect exhaled slowly, as if a long-held weight had finally lifted. I came here to find you, he said, but I think you were the one who found me. Cassius smiled gently. Then let's both stop searching. They stood together as the sunlight grew stronger, filling the cracks of the forum with warmth. In the distance, the river glowed gold, and a small group of children began to play near the steps of an abandoned temple, their laughter echoing softly. Later, as evening fell, Cassius made his way toward the Tiber. The prefect followed, saying little. They stopped at the river's edge, the same place where Cassius had once escaped through the ancient tunnels. The water moved slowly, peacefully, carrying bits of drifting petals and the reflection of torchlight from the opposite bank. Cassius knelt, touching the surface. The river remembers, he said. It carries everything we forget. The prefect nodded, gazing at the water. And what happens now? Cassius smiled. Now Rome dreams again. That's enough. They stayed there until the stars appeared, faint at first, then brighter, until the sky seemed to shimmer with 1,000 unspoken words. Cassius began to hum softly, an old melody once sung in the underground gatherings. The prefect closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. In that moment, there was no empire, no decree, no fear, only two men, one story, and the endless, whispering river. By dawn, Cassius was gone. Some said he walked east toward the hills. Others believed he vanished into the river itself, becoming part of its eternal song. The prefect never hunted again. He resigned from his post, retreating to a quiet villa by the sea, where he spent his days writing not laws, but stories, gentle stories, ones that helped others sleep. And in every tale, he left a small line at the end, written in his old, careful hand, for Cassius, who reminded Rome how to dream. Years later, long after both men were gone, a traveler resting beside the ruins of the Forum swore he heard voices at night, a calm one telling stories of ancient times, and another, older one, listening in silence. The wind carried those voices through the empty streets, across the water, through the olive trees, and the city, vast and ancient, dreamed on.